Okay, so we're going to get started today with exercise 126. And today we're going to create plans from our SketchUp models. So last class we did the elevation views. Today we're going to do plans. Next class we're going to do portfolios. So we're going to take a step back for a little bit. And then next week we'll do our sections and perspectives out of SketchUp. And then the following week is the final. So today we're going to work on a plan view of our model. So I went ahead and I opened the SketchUp file from last class. This was the elevation view that I had done. I'm going to go into my styles drawer here, and I'm going to go to my default styles and switch to that hidden line style, which is that basic line view. And then I need to switch this into a plan view. So I'm going to go into my view, and for right now, camera, I'm going to go into standard views. And let's just go into ISO so I can see this in 3 dimensions for a second. And I'm also going to switch this back into the perspective instead of in parallel projections, just so that I can kind of see my model. And when I start thinking about a plan view, well, number one, obviously I have to look down on my object. But number two, I need to cut through this whole building at a height that's relevant to be the plan view. And we talked about this in the AutoCAD section. When we cut the plan, it's typically about 4 feet off the ground. And we do that because it's above the countertops in the kitchen and it's below the upper cabinets in the kitchen. It tends also to cut through every window and every door. In rare instances, some windows are higher than that, but most of the time it cuts through. It's kind of like that happy medium spot where we can cut through everything and get the most information about our building. So I need to know where 4 feet above my finished floor would be. And the easiest strategy for doing that is actually to create a little cube for myself for reference. I'm going to do this at 4 feet, 4 feet. And then I'm going to use the push-pull tool to pull this up 4 feet. And I'm typing in those values so that I can actually be precise about it. Once I've created that little cube, I'm going to select the whole cube. I'll right-click on it and say Make Group. Remember, that keeps it from sticking to any other objects. And then I'm going to move that up to my finished floor height. And the reason that I'm being careful about that is because my finished floor height is actually above where the ground plane is. So I've moved that cube up to my finished floor height. I'm ultimately going to delete that, but that's going to give me a guide for where I need to cut through my building. So I have that right there sitting on the floor. Now I'm going to use the section tool to create a plan view. I don't have it showing in the simple tool set, so I'm going to go ahead and go to my view toolbars and check the box for large tool set. That opens up the tool panel on the left side here. At the very bottom right corner is the section plane tool. When I click on the section plane, it's going to let me name the section. For clarity, I'm going to call this floor plan. And then I'm going to click on the Place button. And you see that as I move this around, the section plane changes its orientation. Part of the reason that I set up this box is because I know now what the height is, but I also have something to snap to make sure it's horizontal. So there it is, and when I click on the surface of that box, it's going to cut through my building. And we can see that it's cut through the building there. So that's good, but it's also filling in everything that it cut through, which isn't the most helpful thing in the world. So I'm going to go up to my View menu, and I'm going to uncheck Section Fill. Now that's a little bit easier. I can see a little bit better now. Okay, and I can see into my building. So that's good. The other thing is that this is still in perspective. I haven't switched it into parallel projection. So let me go up to the camera. I'm going to go to Standard Views, and I'm going to choose the top view first, so I know I'm looking straight down at the object. Then I'm going to go to Camera again, and I'm going to change from perspective to parallel projection. Now I'm looking straight down. This should look an awful lot like a floor plan. Perfect. So I have that set up. I'm going to turn off a few other things. Let me go to the View menu, and I'm going to uncheck the axes. I'm going to go to the View menu. I'm going to uncheck the guides. I'm going to go to the View menu, and I'm going to turn off the section planes. That one's a really important one because when the section planes are showing, see how it kind of dims? It makes everything a little bit more gray. We want that to go away so that everything's bright white when we bring it in. So let me uncheck section planes. There it is, nice and bright white. And I'm looking down on my plan. That's good. It would be nice if my plan was a little bit further along and I had my doors cut in and whatever, but it'll still work for my collage purposes today. So I'm going to go ahead and save this view, and I'll do that by going to the Scenes drawer, and I'm going to click the plus sign for the Scenes drawer, and we're going to create a scene. I'm going to right-click on it and rename the scene. And I would like that rename to be called, let's see here. Well, maybe not. There we go. This is going to be floor plan. And remember, the advantage of doing that is that I can now flip between, say, my north elevation view and my floor plan view, like that. So it's a saved view. I can always come back to it. I do need to delete that box. And let's see if it will let me. There it is. Because I don't need that box anymore. OK, so I have my plan set up here. At this point, it's time to start doing my exports. So I'm going to go to the File, Export 2D Graphic. I'm going to choose the folder for today. So let me go into my folders. And what are we on? 126. Let me create a new folder. This is going to be the spring of 2019. Oops. And this is going to be floor plan. And this is just the lines version of it. In the options, I'm going to not use the view size. I'm going to increase the width or height. One or the other of these should be about 5,000. I'll take the larger one and change it to 5,000. My quality should be all the way up to best. And I'll go ahead and say OK. And then I'll click on Export. And so there's my first export view. I'm going to go through and do the same set of exports that I did last time, though I will edit some. First one would be to look at what the X-ray view looks like. And in that case, I'm really not going to see too much. I'm going to go through the motions here just so you can see it, but I'm going to always be evaluating, is it working? So I'm on the hidden line mode. I'm going to go into the Edit tab. I'm going to go to the Face Settings, and I'll turn on X-ray. And nothing really shows up, or nothing really helps me. So we're going to go ahead and not worry about that one. I'll skip that one. Likewise, the view with the guides on isn't going to show anything, so I'm not going to do that export either. Those are both optional. So let me go back and uncheck guides. The next one, however, is the shadows. And I am going to show that one. I'm going to go to View, and then I'm going to turn on Shadows. And we can see the shadows come on. Remember, I can adjust the shadows a bit by opening up the Shadows drawer and then changing the time of day or the time of year. And so I'll find a shadow that looks good, call it that. But notice that when SketchUp casts the shadows, it's casting it as if the whole building were cut, where that floor plan is. So I get these jagged edges. That's not accurate to what the floor plan actually is. So I need to make some corrections to that. And so in order to do the export with the shadows, I'm actually going to turn off the section cut. So I'm going to uncheck this section cuts box to get my whole building. Because the shadows that would be cast by the whole building. This would all be shadows. So I'm going to do that. Then I'll go back to my styles. I'll go to my edge settings, and I'll turn off edges. And that leaves me with just the shadows. I'm going to have to do some extra post-processing of my work afterward, because there's some places where the shadows should have shown up that they didn't. And so we'll have to go through and make those corrections. And I'll show you how to do that in a little bit. Let me go ahead and export this, though. I'll go to File and then Export 2D Graphic. And we're going to call this one Shadows. And I'll go ahead and export that. We'll go ahead and turn back on the section fill, or excuse me, the section cuts. Turn off the section fill. Turn back on the edges. And now it's time to go into those sketchy edge styles. So I'm going to switch my styles over into the sketchy edges section. First one I'll pick is the airbrush with endpoints. But I do have to go back to my view menu and turn off section planes. Turn off section fill. I'm going to turn off the shadows. I'm going to turn off the guides. And there it is. At this point, I'll go ahead and export this as well. I'll go to File, Export, 2D Graphic. And this is going to be airbrush. And I'll export. Next style that I tend to export is the pen gray style. Sorry, it's still exporting. There's pen gray. I'll go back through View and then uncheck Section Planes, Section Fill, and the Guides layer. And then I can go ahead and export this one as well. So I'll go to File, Export. Did I turn off the... Yeah, it just looks a little faint to me. Let me go to Export, 2D Graphic. And this one would be the pen gray. I'll just call it pen. And then I'll export that. OK, there we go. So remember, this is a saved view, or a saved scene. So I can always come back if I need some other version of my model. I'll minimize SketchUp, and I'm going to jump over into Photoshop. I already went ahead and opened up Photoshop. With Photoshop open, I'm going to go to the File menu, and I'm going to open that first export, which was the lines version. There's the lines version. I'll go ahead and say Open. I'll press Ctrl-0 so that I can fit the whole thing. And then I'll bring in the other three views. I'll go to File, Place Embedded. And we'll bring in the shadows. Place. Once the shadows are there, I'll go ahead and confirm the placement with the check mark. Now remember, on each of these embedded objects that I bring in, I'm going to need to switch their blending mode from normal to multiply so that we can start to see through as we stack them up. I'll go to File and then Place Embedded. I'm going to bring in the airbrush. I'll confirm. And I'll change my blending mode to multiply. I'll go to File and then Place Embedded. And the last one was the pen. Place. I'll confirm. And then I'm going to change my blending mode on that to be multiply as well. So now I can start to look down on my object and see those pieces come together. In the interest of clarity here, I'm going to rename my layers. So let me double click on each layer. First one is shadows. Next one here is airbrush. This one is pen. And I'm also going to unlock the background layer. So I'll right click on background and say layer from background. This one will be called lines. And I'll go ahead and say OK. Organization starts to become important because there's lots of additional layers that we're going to be creating. And so organizing your layers, naming your layers, makes it a lot easier to find objects long term. So now that I have all of these brought in, I need to think through the various options. And the first thing that's kind of a problem is that my shadows aren't casting quite right. So if we zoom in here a little bit, I'll point out some areas where we're having some trouble. So if I zoom in here and I look on this, obviously I have shadow out here, but this area would also be in shadow. But because I did the full export with the roof being there so that it casts the correct shadow, I have to do some manual filling in. Let me turn off my pen and my airbrush for a second. You guys can still see that OK. It's just a little bit more accurate. And I'm going to use a variety of tools to help me fill this stuff in. I'm going to use the rectangular marquee. The other one that I find particularly effective is the polygonal lasso tool. So not the regular one, but the polygonal one. And the advantage of the polygonal lasso is that you can actually draw straight lines and kind of just click at each point. So I'll come over here, and I'll come up here. Oh, and it looks like I missed a little bit down there at the corner. Let's go to right there. So like that is my selection. I want to paint that in on a layer. The shadows layer right here isn't rasterized yet, so I'm just going to create a new layer. And I'll call this one Shadows 2. And those two. I'll end up merging those together a little bit later on. And I'm going to paint, but I want this exact shade of gray when I paint. So I'll use the eyedropper tool, available right here, to select that color. And you see that when I click on that color, it loads the color as my foreground color. I can then go to my paintbrush, right there, and I can fill this in. Let me increase my size of my brush, and I'll also increase the hardness of the brush, because I'm just filling in with a solid color, and we'll fill that in like that. And so the advantage here is that the color is going to match. This layer, the Shadows 2, should also be a multiply. Let me go back to multiply. There it is. So this is multiplying the shadow. That was my extra selection. So let me go ahead and I'm going to step back here. And go back to right there before I had done it. And I'm going to work on the shadows layer instead of the second layer here. But in order to paint on it, you'll see that when I go ahead and try to start painting on it, it's not going to let me. In order to do that, I need to right-click on the shadows layer and say rasterize layer. And that will take it from being a placed object or an embedded object into being just a set of color pixels. At which point I can go ahead and fill that in. And so that was a better strategy on my end. I apologize for that. But that now fixes that problem. And I can get rid of this extra shadows layer like that. So that's filled in. So let's find some other spots where we've got issues. So right here, this shadow should continue to that point right there. And so in order to do that, the polygonal lasso is a great tool to use. I will click up here on the shadow, and I will find the point where it kind of matches up with the correct angle, which is right about there. I'll come up and close that. Then we can use the paintbrush tool again, but I'm going to select the eyedropper to match this color. And then we'll go ahead and use the paintbrush tool, and we'll fill that piece in as well. This line here is also going to continue. And it's probably going to continue until it matches up with this line here. And this will all be in shadow. So this one's a little bit more complicated to find. So in this scenario, I'm going to use the rectangular marquee first. And I'll start by coming over and creating that selection. So I've started with the horizontal. I'm going to add to that selection this little alcove by the door, like that. And then I need to add with polygonal lasso. I'm going to hold down the Shift key to add to it. And I'm going to come with a diagonal at the same angle until I meet that selection that I already made. We'll come over, come back up, like that. And so that then will be the correct amount to fill in for this section. So I'll go ahead and use my eyedropper. Make sure I pick the same color. There it is. And we'll go ahead and fill that in with the paintbrush tool as well. There it is. And we'll paint that in right like that. So I'm having to go in and make some corrections. Let me press Control minus, and you can see how I'm making those corrections. This area up in here also needs to be filled in. And apparently Siri thinks I'm talking to her. Go figure. Let's fill this in. I'll use my rectangular marquee tool to select that right there. I'm going to use my eyedropper to match this color. and then I'll use my brush tool to fill in that color there, like that. Press Control 0 to see everything. That's correct, that's correct. Oh, a little piece right in here that's missing. We'll go ahead and deal with that. And this shadow was cast by this roof on this roof. That needs to go away. So let me zoom in here. And I'm going to use my polygonal, or excuse me, rectangular marquee. I'm going to select that shadow there. I'll press the delete key so that that goes away. Then I need to fill in polygonal lasso right along this. Oops. Right along that diagonal, like that. Oops. All right, we'll sample this gray and then use my brush and fill that in there. So that's correct. Last little piece is the shadow that would be in the stairs. And so in this scenario, all I need is to match this diagonal there down here. I'll use my polygonal lasso. This one's a little bit more challenging because it involves some guesswork. It sure does not like to click where I want it to click. There we go. And I need to find where this angle hits the building. So I'm saying it's going to be right about there. And we'll come up to here. Like that. And I need to fill that in with this gray. So we'll go ahead and use the eyedropper, select that gray, and then use my paintbrush, and we'll fill that in there as well. OK, so now I've filled that piece in. There's a little bit of other detail right in here. I should fill this little section in. Quick polygonal lasso will help me get through that. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be behind the black lines. There it is. Oops. No! Sorry, I clicked one too many times. I accidentally selected too much there. OK, then we'll use the paintbrush. Eyedropper first to match the color. Use the brush tool, and we'll fill that in. Perfect. Then I'll press Control 0 to zoom out. And now the shadows are corrected for my overall piece. The shadows do take some work, so you have to kind of work through that. But now those are corrected, so I feel pretty good about the shadows. Next thing is to think about maybe I want to fill in where the walls are to make them stand out a little bit more. And I can do that using a brand new layer. So I'll create a new layer, and I'll call this layer Wall Fill. And I'm going to I'm going to work on the lines layer because that will allow me to use the magic wand to select each of the walls. I'll use the magic wand tool. I'll click inside each of the walls. There's 1, 2. All right, that looks pretty good. I could add in these little mullions here a bit. It's always the last thing that you do that you mess up, right? Try that one more time. Hold down Shift to select these. We'll skip the millions for right now. All right, I think I have everything selected. So with all of that selected, I'm going to use my paintbrush tool, but this time I'm going to paint in black rather than in gray. And I'll go ahead and paint over each of these walls. All right, so I've gone ahead and I've painted in where all of those walls are. I'll change the wall fill layer. I painted those on the wrong layer. They painted on the lines layer. Okay. Back up. I want them on their own layer because then I have more control over them. There we go. Sorry, I need to be on the wall fill layer, and then I can paint in black. One more time here. Perfect. So those are on the wall fill layer. And the advantage of that is that I can change that to be a multiply. That's good. But I could also change, if I decided I didn't like the walls being black like that, I could change them to be white by doing an adjustment on the wall fill layer and changing them from black to white. And I could change the blending mode from multiply to lighten, and that would make the interior of the wall perfectly white. So I've got some flexibility when it comes to filling in those sections. Looks like I missed one little section right there. So I could come back in and I could paint again on the wall fill layer, and we could paint that one in, and that would go there. I may have missed a few little pieces along the way, but you guys get the idea of what I was trying to do. Let me press Control-0, and when you zoom out, it starts to stand out like a floor plan. It starts to seem like a floor plan. And so I know this is a bit redundant because we started with AutoCAD and we drew the floor plan in the first place, and now we're going backwards. But I'm showing you this because it depends on how you're doing your modeling. You may have started in SketchUp and need a floor plan afterward instead of doing the opposite. So this is getting a line drawing out of SketchUp. So I've gone ahead. I have that. I have my walls filled in. Now it's time to start thinking about how does this look as a collage piece. And I've struggled with this a bit because finding the right background imagery is really difficult. If you use satellite photos, it's too far away and the detail's not there. If you use airplane photos, it's still a little too far away. If you use a photo that somebody took from climbing a tree, it's not the right angle. The closest photo backdrop that I've found is kite aerial photography. That's about the right distance away to get what the ground would look like. It's where people attach a camera to a kite, fly the kite, and take pictures down. The problem with that, in a forested setting like this one, is that people can't fly kites in a forest because they get tangled in all the branches. So all of the images that are associated with kite photography tend to be wide open meadows, grassy fields, or the beach, even better because it has a strong wind usually. So it just doesn't really work with this site to use a photographic background for your floor plan. So in this scenario, I'm going to show you an alternative, and this ends up being a little bit more of an artistic way of showing it. And that is to use a little bit of a grunge texture to give some ground texture. And so I'll bring in a grunge texture. I'm going to go to File and then Place, Embedded. And I already have, typically I would go online and find a grunge texture live with you guys, but I'm a little skeptical of having the internet work for me. But it is working. So I can find one. I also have a bunch that are available that I've already saved to my flash drive. But this would be Creative Commons image search or even a Google image search. grunge texture. And under settings, or excuse me, under tools, we want usage rights. We want to be able to reuse, labeled for reuse. And also under tools, size, we want larger than 4 megapixel. And so what a grunge texture is, and you guys saw this a little bit way back when we did Photoshop early on, is it's something with some texture. And a lot of times it's pieces like this with kind of a concrete texture background, sometimes the swirls, sometimes the crinkled paper. There's a variety of strategies or examples here that will work. I'm looking for something that's just kind of scratched up. And so something like this might work nicely for me. Go ahead and visit and see if I can download it. There we go. Let's go ahead and download that one. And so sometimes it takes a few, and you've got to play around with it, but that's how I would go about finding it. Like I said, I have a whole bunch that are available on my flash drive already in my resources folder because I've been collecting these for a while. So it's under collage. No, it isn't. It's under grunge textures. There it is. And you can see that I have a bunch of them that I've been downloading over time. Some of them are more from a watercolor perspective, but again, you can pick any one of these, and they'll end up working out rather nicely. I'm going to drop this one in, and there it is. I'm going to rotate that one, and then I'm going to make it larger, like this. I picked one of these that was colored just so that you guys would have to see me deal with the color. But some of them are already black and white. Let's make that even a little bit bigger, maybe like that. I'll go ahead and commit to it. There it is, and we can kind of see it. So it's kind of a wall texture looking thing. So first thing I want to do is I want to convert this to black and white, because obviously as color it's a little bit too strong. So I'll create a new adjustment layer. So I'll go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and this is going to be a channel mixer adjustment. And we can call this black and white. And this is for the grunge. And I'll go ahead and say OK. And I will turn this to monochrome with the little checkbox. Remember to look through your presets and figure out which one looks the best for what it is that you're trying to do. And that one actually, it's kind of a lightish tone. I'm happy with that one. And so we'll go with it. Remember, I want to tie this to the background image. So I'm going to press Control-Alt-G to tie the black and white to the background image. There it is. And now I'd like to be able to cut out for where my building would be. So let's turn those off for just a second. And using just the lines, I'm going to turn off my wall fill and my shadows. I'm going to go ahead and use my magic wand to select the background here. And I want to make sure that I go all the way around my building. Yep, that looks pretty good. And I'm going to go to Select and then Inverse, like that. And then I'll jump back to my background texture, and I'll go ahead and create a layer mask. Let me click on the Add Layer Mask button. Whoops. Let me select Inverse, sorry. And then I'll click on the Add Layer Mask. There it is. And so essentially what I was able to do is I was able to cut out where my building is in relation to this background texture. So I've given it a little context with that background texture, as opposed to just being a plain sheet. The background texture is not on a multiply layer, so I'm not seeing everything. So let me go ahead and switch the background texture and make sure that it is on a multiply layer as well, so that everything's shining through. That way I'm getting my shadows as well as the background. So there we go. And again, I can turn on my pen and my airbrush, but those are not that important quite yet. So now I have this background texture. It's possible that it's too much or too strong. Remember, I can adjust the opacity of that background texture to kind of lighten it up to be just the right amount of context, something like that. So I could stick with this and just purely work with this. The problem here is that if I put this on a design board, it's framed by this background texture. There's no edge. It's just a sharp square. And so it's going to look that way. If I want it to fade out from there, I could do a fade where I can adjust the transparency as it goes out, like I did the top of that elevation view before. or I could bring in a different kind of mask to kind of control where this ends. And I'm going to do that in a little more artistic manner by using kind of an ink droplet to define the border. And so you can do a Google search or a Creative Commons image search for ink drop or ink splatter, something like that, ink splatter. And I'm looking at splatter textures like that. I might even look for, no, I'm not finding too many. How about ink drop? Well, I'd have to spend a little bit more time looking. It might be my size that I'm having trouble with. Drop the size down and see if I can, yeah. So here's a variety of ink splatters, something along these lines to help control it. Like I said before, I already have a bunch that I've downloaded. That one's a particularly nice one in terms of the splatter. But you can see kind of that as a guideline here. So I'm going to bring in one of those. Let me go to File and then Place Embedded. And here are a bunch of my ink splatters. Use that one. And there it is. I went ahead and I brought that one in. I'm going to move that ink up a level. Oh, it's not going to let me right now. I do need to adjust the size of this a little bit. So let me change the opacity of it just so I can see how it overlaps my drawing here. Let's make that a little bit bigger. Let's go down to right about there. OK, that sounds pretty good. I'll go ahead and commit to it. And then I'm going to move it, as soon as this is done, out of being in between the black and white and the background image. There we go. Move it out of that. Perfect. So I want this ink splatter to be the edge of my background texture. And so I need to use that as a layer mask in addition to the layer mask that I already have on my background texture. So this gets a little bit tricky. First thing I'm going to do is on the ink splatter, I'm going to go ahead and let me turn off the rest of these layers so you can see this a little bit more clear. Let me change the opacity up to 100% so you can see it. And I'm going to right click and say rasterize layer. And I'm also going to fill in these two sides with white because it wasn't quite large enough to cover my whole screen here. I'm going to go to my eyedropper, pick the white, and then my brush. And let's make that bigger to make this a little bit faster. And I'll fill that in. I'll fill this side in. There we go. I just didn't want those transparent edges on it. So now I have this. It's set up as black and white. What I need to do now is I need to select the whole thing. And I want to use this as a mask. Transitioning it to be this mask is a little bit challenging. I'm going to go ahead and go to Edit and then Copy. So I have a copy of this image. And in order to move it down to this layer on the mask, I need to go into my channels. And I'm actually going to paste it in here. So let me go ahead and add a channel. And I'm going to go ahead and press Control V to paste that particular piece in as part of this. I'll go back to my layers. And it conveniently didn't show it up. I have to do it on the mask layer. Sorry, let me get rid of this. It was a mistake on my end. I should have just selected the mask. There it is. We'll turn these off. And on the mask layer, that's where I should paste it. Control V, and now it pastes in. Once I have that set up, and then actually I think it needs to be the opposite. So let me go to Image, Adjustments, and then Invert. I think it needs to be this. I'll go back to my layers. And if we look right here on my background, like that, that is then cutting out where that texture should be. Let me go ahead and turn back on the black and white, turn back on my wall fill, etc. And so you can see that now the texture is only applied where that ink spot is, not outside of it. And that's making the edges nice and clear. So it's giving us some context and some texture, but not too much of the texture. This ink layer I can go ahead and get rid of. Yes. It might be helpful for you guys on the screen for me to duplicate this layer. It won't look as good here. Or actually, let me just increase the darkness. There you go. Now you can see it a little bit better. Okay? So I still need to cut out, again, for where the building was. So let me use the lines. Let me click using my magic wand to select the background here. I'm going to go to Select and then Inverse. And on the layer mask here, I'm going to paint in black. Let me get on the layer mask, there we go. Where I want, there we go, in black, there we go. Where I want the building to show up. Like that. So now the building's on top of that. So you can see how I'm starting to layer this stuff up. Okay, so I have that installed. Now maybe I want to, well, two things. One, I may want the shadows to be clipped by the edge of the ink spot too. If I want that to be there, I can use the mask and just copy it to the shadows layer. I'll hold down the Alt key as I drag that mask to the shadows layer, and that'll clip the edges of the shadows where the mask would be as well. So I'm just reusing that mask like that. So we get a little bit of clipping there. Okay, so the last thing that I'll show you guys before I'll turn you loose today is that what if you want to add a little bit more context, like say a tree into this. So I need two things. One, I need the tree, and two, I need the shadow for the tree. So first off, I need the view of what the tree would look like. And you can do a Creative Commons image search, like I've been doing, for tree. So let me go back to here. And so it might be tree plan view or something like that. Let's see, tree, how about tree drawing? Change the size down. And of course, I'm failing miserably at what I'm looking for. Essentially, what I'm looking for, I'll show you an example of it, is a landscape symbol of a tree. And so it's something like one of these. Could be a drawing, could be something that's filled in, depending. So I could take this and I could place that into my building. There's a tree, or a symbol of a tree. The shadows are going this direction, so I want the shadow side of the tree to be in that direction. It's currently in black and white, which is how it should be. And I can then go ahead and place that tree somewhere on the drawing. So say right there. And we'll go ahead and place it. The next thing is I need what the tree looks like in its shadow form. So at that point, let me go ahead and call this a tree. And I'm going to create its own black and white adjustment layer in just a second. So there's the tree. I need the shadow for the tree. So in this case, I would look for tree silhouette. It might be tree symbol. Wow, I'm really failing. Usually I have no problem finding it. I don't know. I'm going to do tree silhouette to look for an example of a tree. So you can see how these are all cut out nicely. You could also cut one of your own out. And so let's say that I like this particular silhouette. I could then take this silhouette and I could save it. Really? How about not that silhouette? How about that one? Anyway, apparently my internet's gone out. But we'll use an example one that I have in stock here. Let me go to File and then Place Embedded. And you have to bear with me for a second because I have to remember where I have the silhouettes stored. There's one. I knew it would be around somewhere. Let me go ahead and place that one in. There's the silhouette or the shadow of the tree. I'm going to rotate that a bit. Remember, I want it to be roughly on axis with that shadow. So if I were to line up that diagonal, I want to make sure that the tree is on the same, because it would be casting the shadow in the same direction, like that. I also need to make sure that it's the right height, so we could make sure that the width and the height need to match. So there's my width being about right. Right there is about right, like that. I need to make sure that the shadow is below the tree. So I'll commit to it, make sure that the shadow is below the tree, like that, so it's casting the shadow correctly. This is too dark compared to the gray, so I need to make an adjustment on the tree shadow layer. So let me go up to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and we'll go to a, let's do a Levels adjustment on it. Control-Alt-G to tie it to the layer below, and then we need to adjust until we get the correct darkness value for the shadow. So it's about there or so. See how I'm doing that? Making that adjustment? Okay, last thing would be to make the tree itself black and white. So there's the tree, New Adjustment Layer on that layer, New Adjustment Layer, Channel Mixer, Control-Alt-G on it, Monochrome, and I'd like one that made it a little bit darker, but I'd have to play around with which one. Now let's do that one, like that. So then I've added the tree and its shadow in. I could do this with a few more symbols of trees around, but this is essentially creating the plan view that I'm after. So this is a little bit more artistic than the one where we collage in with a photo backdrop. We'll go back to the photo backdrop when we do the section next Monday. Remember, next class we're going to go back to portfolios. We're going to talk through covers and binding options and that sort of thing next class. Okay, so I'll let you guys start working. The goal today is to create a plan view. I've taken this a lot further than you may elect to take it, depending on what you want. The background, all of this is just further and further options as you start to decide how far you want it to go. You could get away without the grunge texture. You could get away without the trees. You could start with just a plan. It just depends on what your end result would ultimately be.